friends. This is another episode of Empire of Lies, where we discuss manipulation and disinformation in the Russian media, when fear changes sides. The evening broadcast of the Russian show 60 Minutes began with theatrical seriousness. Skabeeva declared that the West has crossed red lines. But beneath this pathos lay a more important message. For the first time in a long time, fear was heard in the Moscow studio. Not the excitement over retaliatory strikes, not the usual mockery of weak Europeans, but a pervasive fear in the participants' voices at the new reality. The West isn't just watching, it's acting. The program's topic was Wall Street Journal reports about the possible supply of Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine and the transfer of US intelligence data for strikes on Russian energy infrastructure. The hosts tried to wrap this up in their usual rhetoric, that Washington is pushing the world toward catastrophe. But the more they talked, the more obvious it became. Russia finally felt that its internal lines of defense no longer guaranteed security. Fear as the new tone. If you listen closely to the broadcast, the most important thing isn't what Skabeeva says, but how the guests react. The mention of Tomahawks was repeated dozens of times. This isn't a news flash, it's a nervous tick of propaganda. They call the missiles obsolete, unchangeable in the balance of power, yet they devote half the broadcast to them. Their words echo the classic defensive rhetoric of a besieged fortress. We will shoot down, we have adapted, we will withstand everything. But behind this bravado, panic lurks, because for the first time, Russia is confronted not with symbolic sanctions or diplomatic demarches, but with what the Kremlin always considered impossible, the direct intervention of NATO technology and intelligence into the very fabric of war. When the presenters mention that strikes can now be carried out deep within Russian territory, the tone changes. This is no longer a propaganda exercise, but a moment of internal realization. The safety zone is disappearing. The Skabeeva paradox. The program demonstrates a classic paradox of the Russian media system. In an attempt to intimidate the West, it inadvertently exposes Moscow's vulnerability. Skabeeva assures that everything is under control, but the report on Russian missile strikes on Ukraine is accompanied by reports of massive blackouts, power outages, and destruction, which, oddly enough, look more like desperate countermeasures than the confident actions of a victor. Even when the announcement of the modernization of Iskander and Kinzhal missiles is heard, one senses that this is a compensatory narrative, a show of force underpinned by internal anxiety. Russia no longer controls the rhythm of the war, and that's precisely why she turns every news story about Western missiles into an apocalyptic story, as if every new NATO move undermines the foundation of Russia's myth of immunity. The Tomahawk effect for Europe, this is a key moment. It's not just about arms supplies, but a shift in the strategic balance, primarily a psychological one. For decades, Moscow has been pushing the idea on the continent that any increase in military support for Ukraine is a step toward nuclear chaos. But on Skabeeva's broadcast, this threat loses its credibility. Instead of a confident, we will respond, it's we will shoot down. The word will is important here. It's a promise of the future, not confidence in the present. The very rhetoric of the program betrays confusion. They know that Tomahawks are flying not only physically, but also symbolically. They demonstrate that the West is capable of acting without fear. In this logic, the Tomahawk becomes not just a weapon, but a signal. The era of Europe's unilateral vulnerability is over. That's the headline of the American Conservative. According to the publication, Kyiv staged a whole show with the threat of Russian drones to convince Europe of the need for new supplies. The first part of the scenario is unidentified UAVs over Poland. The second is Trump's scandalous statements about Zelensky's victory. And the the third is Tomahawk missiles, which Kyiv can allegedly use to reach the Kremlin. But, as the publication writes, the US simply doesn't have the required number of missiles or the platforms to launch them from Ukrainian territory. Credit must be given to the Trump administration. Unlike the previous one, which suffered from fear of escalation, the current team isn't pressuring the Ukrainians to refrain from long-range strikes. While the Trump administration isn't yet supplying Tomahawk missiles, it's not preventing the Ukrainians from striking deep into Russian territory. And that's precisely what they need to do now. According to Radio Times, NATO prevented Ukraine's capitulation, but failed to change the course of the war. NATO has probably done enough to prevent Ukraine's defeat, but not enough to help it win, or at least to persuade Putin to stop. And unless we, the West, take further steps, let's be honest, Russia is advancing on the front lines. War of nerves. Skabeeva likes to talk about Western psychological operations, but in reality, it's Moscow that's losing the war of nerves. When propaganda wastes airtime explaining in detail the trajectory of a Western missile, it means one thing: they're genuinely afraid it will land. And if Europe has been hesitant to increase military support for Ukraine, this broadcast provides a clear answer. Each new episode of 60 Minutes is a mirror of the Kremlin's fears, which needs no translation. This was the program Empire of Lies. See you soon.
С вами была программа «Империя лжи». Увидимся скоро.